Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, we have a trio of some of the best journalists in Pennsylvania. How about this? Let's talk about the sexual statute of limitations for assault victims, legalizing marijuana. I'm reading this. Gun control, and a voter referendum on November 5th. A big agenda. Let's take it up.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
All right, we have a huge assortment of issues to get to, policies, programs, what's going on in the state of Pennsylvania with the legislature and the governor. Joining me are three reporters, and two of them are sitting across from me. John Micek, he's the editor-in-chief of the Pennsylvania Capital Star, and Jan Murphy, she's the Capital. They keep referring to you as the Capital reporter for Harrisburg Patriot News PennLive. Does that work?
I'll go for that.
You'll go for that.
Sounds
and
good.
Sitting next to me is Katie Meyer. She's the Capital Bureau Chief with WITF and all things public radio, right?
All things public radio.
All right, well, you get the first question. There's a big debate that's been going on sometime in the state capitol over the statute of limitations for sexual assault victims. There are limits now. Some folks want to expand them. Explain.
Sure. So this has been in the works for a very long time. The major changes would be to the civil and criminal statutes of limitations for child sex abuse. So they want to get rid of the criminal statute of limitations. Right now, a victim can sue up until they're 50. It would just get rid of that completely.
So you could sue any age?
Yeah, in a criminal case. Then for the civil statute of limitations, right now it cuts off at 30. That would up it to 55. And that's the component of the bill that everybody agrees on, the component of the effort. There's also a separate issue, and there's other things that are in here, but these are the major parts. The other controversial thing would be opening a retroactive window for lawsuits on cases on which the statute of limitations has already expired. So it would be a 2-year window in which lawsuits could be filed on old cases. And so the Senate, specifically the Senate Republicans, have totally balked at that. They don't want to do it, and it looks like they still don't want to do it. So they think it's unconstitutional. They worry it could bankrupt churches. We've heard from the insurance industry that it opens up liabilities they didn't plan for. So that's been stalled for sessions in a row.
John, this is a tough issue. I mean, you can look at it. There's a little bit of, you want to be fair to the victims, obviously, but the folks charged have to have due process. I mean, go ahead.
I mean, the tough thing is that a lot of the people who've been accused in these cases have long since died. A lot of these priests. But it's a hugely emotional issue, and one that has to be treated with great care and dignity. When you sit there and you listen to the stories from these survivors, and it's gut-wrenching. And I think there's a general consensus that everybody wants to provide some remedy and some relief for them, but getting to yes on that is a hugely complicated matter. They tried in last year's legislative session, sort of almost got to it in the Senate, and then it fell apart, and now here we find ourselves again having the same debate.
Yeah, well, and they're talking, in the Senate, there's some Senate Democrats that want to broaden it even further, and yesterday's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, the state victim advocate, Jen Storm, said that the victims, what they would like to see, or I should call them survivors, they would like to see is a retroactive window for civil and criminal, but the prosecutors that testified said that the criminal is off limit. I mean,
it would be hard to reopen.
You can't go.
It's just really complicated trying to get justice for both. I mean, I think
absolutely.
Well, and the other thing is, and this is where like the Catholic Church component of this comes in. A lot of this was really bolstered by the fact that this big report on 6 of Pennsylvania's 8 Catholic dioceses came out showing just decades of abuse and intentional cover-ups. And so part of this, especially with the civil suits, is about holding institutions to account, even if the actual perpetrators have died. So, and that's the part where the Catholic Church has spent tons of money lobbying against this because they say it would bankrupt churches. It has in some states, even though a lot of the time they can put their assets elsewhere and survive and freeze hiring and things like that. So they manage it. Churches haven't really closed because of this, but they say it damages them. It damages like the good things they can do in the community. People who want to do these retroactive suits to reopen these cases, hold the church accountable, say, listen, if you did this stuff for decades, you should go through some financial turmoil.
I mean, and for some indication of how expensive this is, there's the compensation funds that are put together by churches. The window for claims is either closing or will very soon close. And I think in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia alone, I think your colleagues at HYY reported they spent something on the order of $30 million in payouts.
A lot of money. And those
all
are
right,
all
we got to run to a break. When we come up, there's another controversial issue. It's called legalizing marijuana in this state. And some ramifications. We'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, another big issue before the Pennsylvania legislature is the legalization of marijuana. 11 states have now legalized it. Illinois was the last state. Pennsylvania is one of 24 states that have legalized medicinal marijuana. So I'm going to start with John Micek on this. John Micek, even though voters of our state, 59% in the latest in a Franklin and Marshall College poll say let's legalize it. Governor Wolf is now for it. A guy named Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of the state, is for legalizing and taxing. Take it. Where does it all go?
Nice flex there, by the way, with the product placement. Yeah, so that is where we are now, Terry. Earlier part of this year, Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, who is a big legalization advocate, toured all 67 counties to gauge public opinion on this, and lo and behold, this is another one of these areas where public opinion is well ahead of policymakers, and we now see scrambling to catch up. Governor Tom Wolf, who as recently as last year was on the fence about this, is now safely reelected and defeat-proof, and can throw his support behind this. Attorney General Josh Shapiro, who is running for re-election next year, has now found religion on this as well. Notably, however, there is staunch opposition in the Republican-controlled General Assembly. Governor Wolf also coming out this week for decriminalization for possession of small amounts of marijuana. It's now a misdemeanor that would get bumped down to a summary offense, the functional equivalent of a traffic ticket. They're talking about expungements of past records.
Convictions,
and then today is Thursday. Just yesterday on Wednesday, Wolf and Fetterman came out again to talk about expediting pardons for those who've been convicted for minor offenses.
Jan, as John points out, you covered the legislature for a good many years. To me, legalization doesn't seem likely to pass. But when you get to these other things, decriminalize small amounts, do something about past convictions. What's your sense?
I think that there is a big criminal justice reform interest among the legislators, Republican and Democrat this time. We saw it with the passage of the Clean Slate law a couple years ago now, I guess. I can't help but think that the decriminalization part, because there is even a Republican House member who's introduced legislation to decriminalize. So it seems to me that part of it
has a possibility.
Has a stronger possibility.
Yeah. Well, my feeling about this as someone who spent a lot of time with now Gen Z and millennials, given what I do as a college professor, I wouldn't want to see I'll put it this way, young person, but it could be, life ruined because they had a couple of joints. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me, to ruin somebody's life for that.
And I think more and more people are on your side about that. And I think in previous states that have legalized marijuana, that's been a big critique, because a lot of these crimes, you have to remember, like this is a country that had mandatory minimums in many, many states for a long time. And so minor drug charges could be tacked on and give people much longer sentences than they would have had otherwise. realize it's disproportionately applied to African American men, women too, but men specifically. And so I think this is something where people have said, this is a very long time coming, people in sort of the advocacy communities and people engaged in that part of the issue. So that, I think, again, we're more likely to see action on it, but I can't stress enough, Republican leaders in the House and Senate have been very against the idea of legalization. They call it irresponsible. Yeah,
the House Democratic Whip, Jordan Harris, at a press conference on Wednesday of this week, in fact, was fairly adamant in his stance that these criminal justice reform measures had to be included in any push toward legalization. African Americans get arrested something like 3.5 times the rate of white Pennsylvanians, even though consumption rates are exactly the same. And Mr. Harris pointed out that a conviction for marijuana can affect future prospects for employment, for housing, for education. And again, I mean, this is important stuff.
Yeah. All right. I want to turn to another. Look, we have a voter referendum this year. I want Jan to get into this. It refers to something called Marsy's Law. We all are going to get a chance to amend, do I got this right, the Constitution of the state. And I've heard nothing about this. Now, I'm sure all three of you are going to be writing and you're going to be talking about it on radio. But explain to her, what are people going to get to vote on when they show up at the polls on November 5?
Well,
you get the tough question. Go ahead.
It is a tough one. Simply put, they refer to it as a Victim's Bill of Rights. And it puts into the Constitution some things that are already in law, but this would, make it permanent and harder to change. And I mean, it gets its roots from a situation where, and I believe it was in California, a man was released from prison, and the victim's family ran into him at the grocery store, and they were, horrified. And so they went on this national campaign now to get this Bill of Rights, and they're naming it after their family member who died as a result of the crime that he committed out there. And so that's where Marsy, they refer to as Marsy's
Marsy,
Law.
yeah, that's confusing. So what's it actually do? What will they be asked to add to put into the Constitution?
It gives, one thing is victims would be guaranteed the notification of any hearings, like if they are to be released from prison.
So if somebody's released from prison, there'd be a notification to the victim so they can be aware of it.
And it's worth noting, in many cases, this already happens because we already have these things in law.
But they're codifying it in the Constitution.
And so that would allow people to do things like motion a court if they feel like that right is been compromised.
We're going to leave this. We're going to run to a break. But you're going to have to get a chance to vote on it. And I'm sure you can read what these folks all write and get caught up. But here we go, gun control, what's going on? We'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, I'm chatting with three of the state's leading reporters. We're talking about a whole variety of issues before the legislature, and at least one that's going to come before the voters. It's called Marsy's Law. We just chatted about that. You wanted to add a comment to it?
Yeah, just a quick thing, because I think a lot of people see Victims' Bill of Rights and they're like, oh, who's going to oppose that? And but the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, is opposing it. They've opposed it in a lot of states, and it's because they say, these things, again, it already exists in statute.
Right.
It's not going to make a ton of changes, and they are concerned that it's going to set up some sort of conflict between victims and the accused. Yeah. The accused, of course, are already given rights because they have the weight of the state against them. And so the people who support Marsy's Law, they say it's not going to be a conflict. Don't worry about it. ACLU says we don't know how it's going to be used.
Before I get to John Micek on gun control, it's important to note that a statute can be changed by the legislature and the governor. The Constitution itself requires a vote by the voters in a referendum. So that is much more of a permanent feature.
It's much harder.
Constitutional changes are not common in our country.
So Marsy's law has already passed the House and Senate in 2 consecutive sessions with the same language.
There you go. All right, John. I'll tell you what, the folks who support gun control were very excited a couple of weeks ago. Universal background checks, red flag laws, etc. Snail's pace
has now met the immovable object that is the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Yeah, I mean, Terry, coming back in after a summer of just horrific carnage across the United States, gun violence reduction advocates thought this might now be a time for the Pennsylvania legislature to act. That was fairly efficiently shut down when the General Assembly came back in. A so-called red flag law and extreme risk protection order, which would allow police acting with court order to temporarily seize somebody's weapons if they believe to pose a threat to either themselves or to the public. That seemed like that was going to be the easiest thing to do. Rob Kaufman, the Republican of Franklin County who chairs the House Judiciary Committee, shut that one down. Said that that will not be taken up as long as, and I love the third person thing, as long as Chairman Kaufman is in charge of the committee. In the Senate, it looks like they have not shut the door entirely. They held 2 days worth of public hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Lisa Baker, the Luzerne County Republican who chairs that panel, remains open to the idea. Tom Killian, the Delaware County Senator who's crafting that bill, is going to go back and retool to maybe make it a little bit more palatable. But again, we're now sort of in this kind of inevitable legislative inertia. Yeah,
you're shaking your head. It doesn't look like, I mean, the enthusiasm, and I should say, and even the public interest, given what's going on in Washington with impeachment, it seems like almost everything has dropped into a second tier, even in states. But are you, again...
I don't know.
We all,
a lot of stuff.
But we all agree there that we don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of, I think it's kind of ironic that the governor is out there talking about these big issues facing Pennsylvania. He's pointing out all of our problems, and we have a General Assembly that just is so reluctant to try to do anything about them.
And it's not like, I mean, expand background checks, point number one. The red flag laws, if you give a court has to order it. It's not done without due process.
Yeah.
It would seem like that would make, a lot more,
Well, one of the problems that people bring up, because you're right, there's an expedited hearing once this person is kind of served with a red flag order, an extreme risk protection order.
Right.
And so the specific concern, if you really want to get that deep into it, is that there's a portion of the trial in which the plaintiff or the defendant, if you want to call it that, can't really respond. Because it's, again, a quick trial. It's meant to get rid of the guns quickly so they don't kill themselves or others.
Sure.
And so they can, again, appeal it. That was inserted into the language. So they do have recourse, but not initially. It's
legal in 17 states and in the District of Columbia, and in at least 2 states, Connecticut and Indiana, there's been data to show that these laws provably reduce suicides and active violence.
Yeah, Connecticut did it in 1999.
Yeah.
Indiana was 2005.
I mean, we're not talking about assault weapon bans. We're not talking about taking somebody's gun rights.
Well, I mean, you've run the numbers in your own polls, Terry. You know where public opinion is on this.
Yeah, there's no doubt. All right, we're going to run to a break. But there is another important topic that I want to bring up. Pennsylvania has been irrelevant in the nominations of presidential candidates, even though we've been a critical state in the election, in the general election of a president. And so there have been proposals to do a variety of things, change our primary date, and then what to do with voters that aren't in a party. Should they be able to, they're called unaffiliated, should they be able to participate in a primary election? We'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
All right, as I indicated before the break, primary date change. Our primary next year, I think, is April 28. It's at the end of April. The nomination process begins in February with Iowa and New Hampshire. And John, you're looking at me. You have a little difference of an opinion with me about whether we're relevant or not, right?
Well, I mean, you know, there are always bills every cycle. And we were here a couple of weeks ago with a couple of lawmakers who were talking about bumping up the primary date, Terry. But I mean, I think back to 2008. The Democratic primary race between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Right.
You know, and there's an argument to be made that maybe the delegate math was on Obama's side coming into Pennsylvania, but there's no doubt the state was hotly contested. So when people roll their eyes and say we're kind of irrelevant to the process, I'm not entirely convinced.
You mentioned one election out of 50.
Well, you got to 84. I mean, 84. Look, 2012. The only way Obama was going to lose is if we got hit by a meteor.
Oh, sure.
You know, 2002,
Sure.
in 2016. Hillary Clinton had the state pretty well sealed up, but that was a nominating fight that dragged into the convention with the Sanders people still contesting it right down to the end.
Yeah.
So, you know, who knows?
But the bigger question is, are we going to change the date of the primary?
No.
No, that's
all
too
of
big.
you agree?
It's, again, the rule of thumb with the legislature is if it's a really big change, it needs to be like really top of line for like several sessions in a row. They need to be really talking about it. And they haven't been.
So we're irrelevant. You all don't have to agree.
It depends on your interpretation, Terry.
It's the weather. Everyone talks about government reform and nobody does anything about it.
All right, we have another issue, and that's we have somewhere between 700 and 800,000 what are called unaffiliated voters. They're not in a political party. So the big question then is, should an unaffiliated voter be able to sign up to vote in a Democratic primary or a Republican, or I guess a Green or a Libertarian, right? Pick your party. Is that going anywhere?
There's certainly bipartisan interest in that, but I talked to Kristen Phillips Hill, was someone who, a senator from York County, was concerned about. She said her constituents were telling her, Republicans are saying, I don't want these unaffiliated people, you know, having a say in who my nominee is. And so she opposed it in the committee when the Senate State Government Committee was looking at that. And the other senator, and I can't remember who it was right now, but he opposed it because he just said, when you're running for the Republican nomination, you target all your mailings and everything to the Republican registered voters. If there's unaffiliated voters, I mean, the campaign spending has got to go up because you have to send out your mailings to so many more people. So there's some, you know, that's the logistical argument.
I used to be agnostic about this issue.
You're not anymore?
I'm not anymore.
So what's your feeling?
Well, I mean, if the parties would like closed primaries, then I suggest the parties pay for the primaries. I mean, we were talking about taxpayers of the state of Pennsylvania who are being foreclosed from the electoral process. Their tax money is going to foot the bill for these primary elections. They're not being allowed to participate. If the knock is constantly that we don't have enough people involved in the democratic process, one really easy way to fix that would be to open up the primaries. And then when we invariably complain that turnout is low, and we have a remedy in hand, and we don't act on it, it's another one of these things where there's never a through line on policy.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time, but going to happen, yes or no?
Well, I will say Joe Scarnati, Senate President Pro Tem, he's behind it, and that gives the bill some oomph because he has a lot of power.
All right. I think we covered enough subjects here in this half hour. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.